I am going to take you through the latest adult active lives data for Herefordshire. I'm going to get into the active lives and the physical activity data in a few slides' time. I'm going to start off though by just reminding us the kind of data that we're looking at and getting that in our head, and then I'm going to just cover a couple of slides talking about some broader trends that are certainly happening nationally and whether they matter to Herefordshire that we might need to just have in the back of our mind when we think about the physical activity data. So let's, and just remember, this is a rolling survey that's done by Ipsos Mori on behalf of England, OHID, Office of Health, Inequalities and Disparities, something like that, Improvement in Disparities, and the Department for Transport is the other investor in the survey, and it's a rolling survey. The survey is at least 400 adults in every local authority in the country. Some local authority areas get a larger sample due to levels of inactivity, high levels of inactivity, or because of a large population. Herefordshire isn't one of those areas, so it gets a sample of around 400 adults over the age of 16. And I'll build on that kind of some of those definitions as we go through the slides. But before we get into some of the data, I should just say questions. Pop them in the chat, put your hand up. I'll try, if they're about the data that you're seeing and how you're understanding it, you know, ask questions as we go along. It's just easier to deal with them as the information's in front of us. If it's your thoughts and questions about what we might do with this and the implications of it, then just save them, and I'll try and break it on a couple of occasions just to give you a chance to share if you want to. I just want to put this data into context, okay, that what we're going to be looking at, and the data that we're going to be looking at is population level data. So it's giving us data around the proportion of inactive and active people in our population and the trends over time. That's what some of the analysis that we're going to be doing. And so we're looking at this sphere of interest space, that, you know, inactivity, inequalities, you know, maybe some further work looking at the relationship with health outcomes and so on and so forth. And they're in our sphere of interest because they're really influenced by many different factors, and some of those factors are not directly in our gift of control, okay? So trying to just keep that in mind, that we're talking population level. And this diagram in front of us, it just to help you kind of get your head around, it's come out of some work that Dr. Kitty Shern has done for the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership. It started in Greater Manchester, but it's being used quite nationally now. And what I'm just wanting to keep in mind is we've all got our own context, you know, across Herefordshire. We've been presented to Worcestershire this morning. It'll be very different, and it'll be very different in different places within Herefordshire. You know, the population makeup, the socio-demographic factors, the geography, the topography, the infrastructure, the provision, etc., is unique in every part of our country. There will be patterns, but there's also uniqueness. And then we've got the things that we can do, the things that we can control. You know, what is it that Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire can actually do? What is it that your organisations can actually do? And how does that impact on those around us and the people that we work with? And how does that shift or not these outcomes? And what the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership evidence, why is my slide not working, has started to show us is that it started to tell us that there are 9 conditions that we have probably got a bit more of an influence over than the outcomes if we work collectively. And the state of these conditions in our places, the state of how well we have processes in place for collecting and sharing data around movement and identifying barriers and enablers, how well what our built environment looks like, what our leadership looks like, how well we collaborate. It's starting to surface and evidence these 9 conditions that are, depending on the state of the conditions in the place, they kind of give a sense of whether the outcome is good or bad. Okay, and this learning is helping us to start to think about, well, actually, some of these things are probably more of it in our influence if we can work together on trying to shift them, because they're not in the gift of any one organisation. So it's through collaboration and collective action that we can maybe start to try and shift these conditions and then try and observe whether it shifts the population level outcome. And most of the data that well, all the data I'm going to be talking about today is that kind of population level across the whole of the adult population in Herefordshire. A couple of significant things that we need to hold in our head as we think about the physical activity data that I'm just going to share with you first. And there's two, there's two kind of buckets for trends, two spaces where we've got trends that we need to be conscious of. One is around how our population is constantly changing. Okay, it's constantly shifting, and some of that matters, and I'll come back to why that matters in a minute. And then also, since the pandemic and then the cost of living crisis, we've also got some economic trends that are certainly playing out nationally, and we'll see in a slide or two as to whether they're playing out in Herefordshire, and they're important because we know people that are more affluent are more likely to be active, and people that are living on lower incomes are less likely to be active. And so some of these macro level trends are quite important for us to try and observe when we think about the physical activity data. Let's just go into that demographic stuff a little bit. The population of the country is growing. The population of Herefordshire is growing, and it's not quite as quick as what's happening nationally, but it is still a steady increase. But what's more important to keep in our mind in Herefordshire is that it has a larger older population already, and that is also growing. And it's going to continue to grow, and we're already up to nearly a third of our population that's over the age of 65. Okay, and we know, and we'll have a look at this later, that usually inactivity levels decrease with inactivity increases as we age. Okay, and it's often related to frailty and the onset of long-term health conditions. And so the fact that we're getting more older people in our population is could potentially mean there's more inactive people. So we just need to keep that in our head as we start to think about the data, but the data is quite interesting. That's one of the things I was on a little rummage around in. Just to come to these economic trends, okay, what we're seeing, and the increase, some of the increases in Herefordshire aren't as significant as what's happening in other parts of the country. However, there are, over the last 12 months, more people claiming universal credit. Okay, it's gone up by around 1,700 people, and the trend is upwards as it is nationally. There is a trend of more children and young people being seen as living in relative low income, living in poverty. That is a trend that's happening nationally and is an indicator of family income, family wealth. Now, this trend in the top corner and the two on the right actually not as significant for Herefordshire as they are for other parts of the country. Around 4% of our working age population are long-term sick or disabled, which is actually quite small. What we see, the reason why we put that in some parts of the country, that's increased quite dramatically. Okay, and the trend nationally is of an increasing proportion of the working age population that are not in the workforce because of long-term health conditions. And so that's not as much as play in Herefordshire as it is in other parts of the country, and neither is unemployment. Okay, so there are two factors that aren't, but we do still have an increasing amount of families in poverty and people relying or claiming universal credit. Keep that in mind, because age and economic activity and wealth are important parts to think about when we think about movement behaviour. And that's what I'm going to go into now. I'm going to go into just helping unpick as much as we can with a sample of 400 what it's telling us and where might some of the issues be and what are the trends looking like. Is it positive? Is it negative? And let's start with some good news. Okay, and what we've got in the latest year of data is a pretty interesting rise in activity levels. So what are you looking at on your screen? Let me explain that. The red dots, let's start with the red dots because that's the bit that I always find the most important. The red dot is the proportion of inactive people, and I'll come to the term inactive in a minute, in Herefordshire, okay, for the 9 years of data that we've got. So it was 27% of the population in 2015-16. It's now in the latest data set, 20%. Okay, so we've got quite a difference there, but you can see that that difference has happened in the latest year. One of the things that's happened in the latest year of data is the sample has got a little bit smaller. Okay, it was 500 historically. It's now got a base of 400. Is that at play? Only time will tell. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. But at the moment, in this chunk of data, in this latest year of data, we've got an increase in activity levels, the 69% that's gone up from 66 the previous year, and a decrease in inactivity levels. Let me just remind you what those terms are all about. The Chief Medical Officer recommends that we do 150 minutes of moderate intensity, and I will come back to that term in a slide or two, of physical activity a week. If we achieve 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity, we're active, we're in the green dot, okay? If we're doing less than 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity a week, then we're in the red dot. Okay, so we're doing under 30, we're deemed as inactive. But that term moderate intensity is important, and I'll come back to that later. The grey lines that are faded in the background is how Herefordshire compares to England. It's not a particularly fair comparator, in my view, because your age profile of Herefordshire is very different to England. You've got a significantly more bigger chunk of people over the age of 65. You have also got a much bigger white British population than there is nationally, in the sense of a proportion, and you know, so it's not a very good comparator. However, what's positive is we seem to have, in this latest chunk of information, increase in activity levels and decrease in inactivity levels, which is a good starting point. But that isn't always distributed fairly, and I will come back to that later as well. But just to turn this into a number, keep pressing the wrong button. We've got about 32,000 adults over the age of 16 that are currently inactive. Okay, so that's still quite a chunk of our population that aren't moving enough. However, some of this part of our population is could be moving quite a bit. And so how can you be moving quite a bit and yet be inactive? Let me explain. Okay. The Chief Medical Officer has that term, moderate intensity, in the definition for a very good reason. We need to get our ticker up, okay? Getting our ticker up helps with the prevention of cardiovascular disease and a lot of other benefits and a lot of other cancers and so on and so forth. And so moderate intensity is a way of expressing us getting our heart rate up, okay? It's not sprinting, okay? For most people, it is a brisk walk, okay? If you're super fit, you might need to jog to get into moderate intensity. You might need to just pick up the pace a little bit. If you're older and frailer, actually any kind of low intensity movement is probably getting your heart rate up and you're into moderate intensity, okay? For most people, it is a brisk walk, okay? And we know from the data that we have around 10 of those 32,000 people, so 10,000 people that are missing the intensity. What does that mean? When they fill in the survey and they are asked what activities they do, it then asks them whether that activity got the heart rate up. They may have felt, did you feel warmer? You may have begun to sweat. If they tick no for that, those minutes are classed as low intensity and they don't count towards your achievement of the outcome because you're not getting the cardiovascular benefit of it. You've also got 2% of the population in Herefordshire, to roughly 2,000 people, that are doing between 1 and 29 minutes. So you've got 12,000 of the 32,000 that are doing something, but not enough. Okay, and then you've got the group on the left, which is the sedentary group. And the reason why I've laboured this a little bit is, are the tactics different? Okay, if you're already removing, just for reference, most light minutes are done walking, okay, and gardening is the second big contributor to that. And so, you know, if you're active, think dog walkers might think of themselves going out for a walk a couple of half hours a day, doing quite a lot of minutes. They're filling this survey in because I've got a small dog and it stops a lot. And they are saying they're light only minutes, but they might think of themselves as being actually quite active. I don't know. But the tactics there to try and create change might be quite different to the tactics for people that might, on the left-hand side, that might be habitually sedentary and not moving at all, or moving very little, where campaigning isn't going to work. Whereas campaigning, helping people realize that they need to get their heart rate up to get to the benefits of movement, might work. And that's certainly something that we need to be pondering, is how do we differentiate targets for people that are displaying different kinds of behavior. I'm going to move us on. Right, I'm going to just take a little, I'll press the wrong button again. And all the way back here, I am going to move us on. So the data will let us look at different demographic groups in terms of inactivity. Okay, and I'm going to just do a little bit around gender and age, disability, gender and age is going to be, and then I'm going to point out a couple of gaps as when I get to the end of these next few slides. And so what you're looking at here is the proportion of inactive people that have a limited illness or disability in Herefordshire and what their activity levels look like compared to those without a limited illness or disability, the black blobs at the bottom. Okay, and you can see over time we have had a decrease in inactivity levels among those people with a limited illness or disability, which is positive, and it's gone up, it's wiggled around, but it is overall heading down. Apart from a little blip last year, there's been a fairly consistent pattern moving downwards, which is quite positive. That's a good thing. However, look at the size of the inequality. You're still twice as likely to be inactive if you have a limited illness or disability compared to those people without. Okay, and that inequality of that scale is pretty common across the whole of the country. And we see in the data that as soon as someone gets a limited illness or disability, their inactivity shoots through the roof. Okay, and we know there's a lot of great work going on in the healthcare system. I was at an event with Stephen and Lorraine Kerry yesterday from Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire, exploring the work that Active Partnerships are doing around the healthcare system and in trying to integrate movement into it. And we've still got some work to do here. We need to just remember that and I'll pick this up in a couple of slides time. And we do need to just remember this correlation with age. Okay, that as we age, we develop long-term health conditions, and that pattern is there. But there's also, you know, there is some evidence in some parts of the country. I'm not saying that this is the case for Herefordshire, that actually some of that's happening earlier, especially in our lower socioeconomic communities, that we're getting younger working age adults living with long-term health conditions earlier, which is obviously then impacting on inactivity, because as soon as we get a health condition, we're more likely to not move. And so there's some work to be done around how do we shift that? What can we do to keep this trend? It wouldn't be great if in another 9 years, 8 years, we've gone down, you know, nearly 20 percentage points again. Then those lines have been near enough in line with those dots have been near enough in line with each other. How do we keep this trend line going in the right direction is something for us to kind of think about. I'm going to move us on to gender. And there's some commonality here between Worcestershire and Herefordshire, because in the latest share of data, there's very little gender inequality. Okay, which is quite intriguing. And so we've got a similarity with Worcestershire here, where there's not much gender gap, which is a good thing. But let's keep in mind that that won't be the case for all women or men. So, you know, there is something to certainly consider here. We certainly know from the national data set that women in our Asian communities are much more likely to be inactive than men in our Asian communities. And so some of the second demographics, second characteristics will be important. Now, the challenge that we've got in Herefordshire is the small sample size. To be able to unpick some of that as much as we'd like. But there are some things we can do if it's helpful to people. We can aggregate data and we can have a look at it and we can unpick it a little bit more. And that gender inequality has not been particularly large for the last few years, which is quite positive, because since the pandemic, nationally, the gap between men and women's activity levels was closing. You know, women were catching up in terms of lower levels of inactivity with men pre-pandemic, and there was quite a sustained trend there. Then the pandemic arrived and opened the gap up bigger than what it was at the baseline, and it went out to about 6 percentage points. I think it's closed a little bit to around 3, 4, something like that off the top of my head. So we're bucking the trend with national. We've certainly, you know, got a different situation, so that's positive. But we do just need to be mindful about how characteristics intersect, and I will come back to that in a minute or two. I am going to move us on though. Okay, this is what inactivity looks like by age. That blue faded background is what this norm, not the exact proportion of it, but the trend is usually a fairly steady gradient nationally. Not all the time, but usually our 16 to 24, our 16 to 34-year-olds are our least inactive. Okay, and you can certainly see that here in Herefordshire, very low. 7% is very low, which is a real positive, because that's not the case in other parts of the country. In other parts of the country, that group is becoming a challenge, which is quite fascinating. And then it goes up. It usually goes up as you age. Inactivity tends to just go up in a steady gradient until you get to 75 plus, and then it shoots through the roof, because the majority, or certainly almost the majority of people in that age group, will have a long-term health condition. And we haven't quite got that pattern in Herefordshire. We've got very low levels of inactivity amongst our 16 to 34-year-olds, and then it jumps. Then it drops back a little bit, and then it wobbles around. Okay, a couple of things that I've already observed the very low proportion of inactivity amongst our 16 to 34-year-olds. Okay, we've also got a really interesting 65 to 74-year-olds in the current data, and that's what I was just playing around in the background checking, was the sample size. The sample size is pretty robust. It's nearly 100 people, so I'm not worried about that at all. So there's something in there that's quite intriguing, because it's out of kilter with now we do often get a post-retirement dip in inactivity. Okay, woo, I'm retired, I'm going to go play golf, or whatever it is that we decide that we're going to go and do. We do see it. It's not usually as significant as we're seeing here in Herefordshire. Something for us to keep an eye on. It's a real positive, but then look at the cliff face. Look at what happens when we tick over over the age of 75 and how much it jumps. Okay, and is out of kilter. I'm going to go back to my point earlier. A third of the population, almost a third of the population, is over 65 now. What's it going to be like in 10 years? What's our infrastructure like for a growing population that's over the age of 75 and not moving, or finding it much harder to move in a very rural county, and we're starting to see people not being able to drive, and etc, etc, etc. There was a really interesting conversation came up in the last workshop in Worcestershire around what does the numbers going into care look like, and because that might be an interesting space for us to think about a little bit. There's certainly some interesting work going on in Wiltshire, which is another very rural part of the country, where they're active. They're not called Active Wiltshire, they're called WASP, and that partnership there is doing some really interesting work with care homes and the care home networks around trying to build movement into daily life for people that are in supported care, and that might be something that we might need to get a better handle on, of what it looks like in Herefordshire if we want to stop this trend from keep this trend going in the right direction, because at the moment it's certainly going in the direction we'd like it to. So there's something for us to just kind of think about there. Now, there's two groups that are normally part of our conversation that I can't talk to you about, not on their own anyway. And so that group is our culturally diverse, the ethnicity. We haven't got a sample big enough, okay, without aggregating years of data. And then we'd probably only still get a group for white, maybe some data for white, other, possibly Asian, but I might not even be big enough for that, even when we aggregate years of data. So that is one gap that this data isn't helping us understand for Herefordshire. Another gap, which is and I think this is a consequence of the smaller sample this year, is the sample for people in lower socioeconomic groups is small and is too. We have some quite strict rules with Sport England about what data we're allowed to publish, and the sample for that group is too small for us to publish. So we haven't, and it's a quite a small sample, which might be another. And whilst they'll weight it and they'll do their weighting in the background, it might be one of the reasons why we've got this dip in inactivity in this latest year of data compared to the previous years where the sample was a bit bigger and we could publish the data and understand activity levels. So we've got a bit of a challenge in that space now, and we're happy to have a conversation with Simon, and I'd love your thoughts on, do we need to try and fill that? Do we need to try and maybe aggregate a couple of years of data and look at a rolling trend on an aggregated data point so that the sample's big enough? So there's some things that we can do to try and understand the picture that that's with that group, because I think it's quite important. Whereas when it comes to ethnicity, the samples are just too small. So we'd have to aggregate all 9 years of data to be able to do it. Whereas it's not the case with the lower socioeconomic group. And that's important because we know that people living on lower incomes are much more likely to experience being inactive. There is an interesting, they've only published the last 2 years of data with this metric in it. And it's a really interesting bit of statistical analysis, if you're interested in that kind of thing, where they have looked at the characteristics that people have that are more likely to lead to people mean that people are inactive. And they've looked at single characteristics, and I've covered some of them today, like disability and age. They've looked at single characteristics, but they've then started to look at how those characteristics intersect. Sport England have looked at these intersecting characteristics, and they've identified 6 characteristics, and then they've identified activity levels if you have none of those characteristics, if you have one of them, or whether you have 2 or more of them. And so when I go on to the next slide, there's a couple of things, but before I get into the data on the next slide, I'm going to explain the characteristics. Okay, so look at the little circle if that's where you want to start, because that's a visual representation of the 6 characteristics that mean that you're more likely to experience inactivity. And I'm just going to go through those first. Okay, so the first one is being of Asian or Black heritage. So if you're from Asian or Black Afro-Caribbean communities, you're statistically more likely to experience inactivity. If you're a woman that is pregnant or a parent, male or female, of a child that is under the age of 1, you're statistically more likely to experience being inactive. I can vouch for that myself. It was like a bomb being let off when our first child. I can't even think about going outside, let alone moving. If you have a limiting illness or disability, you are again more likely to experience inactivity. If you're on lower incomes, if you're of Muslim faith, or if you're over the age of 65. Now, what happens to inactivity and what active levels? Because you're looking at the proportion that's active. So let me explain the chart now. Okay, so if you have none of those characteristics, i.e., I'm somebody that has none of those characteristics, 78% of people that don't have any of those characteristics are achieving the outcome. They're achieving 150 minutes. Okay, so that's quite positive. Now that's high, 74% nationally. So we're quite a bit higher than national, which is interesting in itself, and very positive. Okay, so our environment and our infrastructure and our provision is doing pretty well for those people. Okay, if you have one of those characteristics, of which I've explained some of those groups in terms of an inactivity on some of the previous slides. So if you're over 65, or if you're disabled, if you have one of those characteristics across all of those 6 groups, 63% of people achieve the outcome of 150 minutes. Okay, so we've got a big drop. We've got a big drop down 15 percentage points straight away. But look what happens when you have 2 or more characteristics. We get another big drop. Okay, and now we've got quite a sizable difference between no characteristics and 2 or more characteristics and your likelihood of being active. And so the way that these characteristics intersect is the place where we have greater challenge. And what I just to put an England reference, because that 55% is also quite positive, because in nationally it's 44%, so you're quite a bit higher than that. So there's something about the Herefordshire environment, something about the Herefordshire infrastructure and culture and all of that that's actually quite positive. But we still got a pretty striking inequality between those that don't have any of those 6 characteristics and the part of our population that does. By the way, in Worcestershire, it's down at, I can't remember, 38, I want to say it was. So that right-hand column that's 55 in Herefordshire is down at 38 in Worcestershire, which is really intriguing. Now, we haven't unpicked this any more than that at the moment. And there's probably things that we can do, like, you know, what the size of those different groups of different multiple characteristics, to try and bring this to life a bit more that you might be interested in. And we can have a little bit of space at time at the end to just see if you want to pick up on any of that. I've only got a few. Press the wrong button again. I've only got a few more slides now. I'm going to move us on to how we get our minutes. Okay, what activities we do. Okay, I want you to imagine all of the minutes. Different ways that we could collect minutes being active, okay, bar one. Okay, and I haven't mentioned that in this presentation because the lower socioeconomic information isn't in, but I am going to just remind people that this survey does not ask about the minutes you do at work. Okay, and if you are living on lower incomes, which is a part of our population that are more likely to experience being inactive, then you're more likely to be doing manual labor or labor where you will spend a lot of time on your feet. And this survey doesn't ask about it. Okay, so it's one part, and it would count towards the outcome, by the way. It is part of the chief medical officer that if you get minutes from work, that's fine. Okay, there's mixed evidence about the benefit of it. There's mixed evidence around doing active minutes under stress, and so on and so forth, but it does count towards the outcome. But it's not collected by this survey. Okay, and we need to just keep that in mind. What is collected, though, is pretty much every other way that you can be active. And I'm going to just show you what that breakdown of minutes, where we get our minutes from by these different categories of movement. Okay, so walking for leisure. Okay, 30% of our minutes in Herefordshire come from walking for leisure. Okay, what is that? That's going out, choosing to go out for a walk. Okay, you might be doing it to get out some fresh air, you might be doing it for health, you might be taking your kids out. It's not about walking from your house to the supermarket to go shopping. That's walking for travel. Okay, or walking to work. That's walking for travel. Okay, this is for you going out for other motivations. That's not getting to a place for a specific reason. Okay, walking for leisure, much more likely to be done by white middle class people, basically, is the group that are much more likely to get minutes from walking for leisure. Okay, our culturally diverse communities, our lower income communities, some of the groups that are more likely to experience lower levels of inactivity are less likely to walk for leisure. Okay, which is an interesting thing in itself. Traditional sport, what on earth does that all mean? Well, it's everything that's not in the other groups. So let me just give you all your football, all your cricket, all your athletics, all your swimming, all your running, all your canoeing, all of your mountain climbing, all of your tennis, all of your racket sports, all of your team sports. All the minutes done across all of that is in traditional sport. What's not in traditional sport are your Joe Wicks and your gyms and your fitness classes, and you're doing your barbells, dumbbells at home, all of that. That's in fitness activities. Okay, so there is a separation there and they're the two main spaces where provision kicks in big time. Okay, a lot of those minutes will be potentially provided by clubs, leisure centres, facilities, dedicated spaces, etc., etc. Not all of them mind, but a big proportion of them would be. You've then got 18% of your minutes from gardening, 12% of minutes come from fitness activities, 12% of minutes come from walking for travel. That's low. there's some very good reasons why it's low. Firstly, Herefordshire is a very rural place, okay, and so walking for travel is going to be a bit trickier, arguably, especially potentially if you relate it with work. Also, the pandemic absolutely battered it. Okay, it did nationally. Now it's bounced back a bit nationally, but it hasn't got back to pre-pandemic levels. Okay, and there's certain groups that are much more likely to walk for travel. People on lower incomes, culturally diverse communities. Why? Don't have access to a car. Okay, and so we need to just be conscious that these different activities are utilised and practiced or participated in differently by different parts of our community. You've then got 7% of minutes from all cycling activities, whether you are cycling to and from work or whether you are going mountain biking over the Herefordshire hills. That's in the cycling minutes. And then you've got about 1% of minutes from dance. Okay, remember, work's not in there, and there's some quite interesting patterns in that. I would just which goes on to my next slide. Just think of the scale of the minutes that are done outside. Okay, most of that walking for leisure, outside, gardening, outside, walking for travel, outside. Okay, and so the way our environment enables or disables us to be move is really quite important. And just to put that into context is the next slide. Okay, 78% of all minutes, okay, are outside. We need to just keep that in mind. So our environment, how we feel about going outside, how we feel about walking on our streets, how we feel about whether we've got a garden or not, whether we want to, white British gardening is another white British domain, not just middle class. It's actually a bit more broader than that, but it's very white British activity. And why? Because our Asian community in particular are much more likely to live in multi-generational households. They're more likely to live in urban areas where a garden might be less likely to have one, etc., etc., etc. But I want you to just keep in your head just how important moving outdoor and in our environment is, and it's more important in Herefordshire than it is in England. Okay, because 78% of all minutes are done outside in Herefordshire, 75% in England. And we do see some really big differences in this, especially when it comes to our culturally diverse community. I was mentioning in the Worcestershire workshop earlier that some work that we're doing in Tameside. And when you look at this for the Asian community in Tameside, where there's quite a big Asian community, it's about 10% of the population now, and it's growing rapidly. You're actually only 60% of minutes have done outside, and they're much more reliant on indoor spaces, and they're needing to start to explore why, whether that's safety, whether that's experience of racism. What is it that is actually, or is it because that part of our community is in our most densely populated urban part of Tameside? All of those things need to be tried to unpick in order to be able to shift activity levels for that group, because walking, whether we're doing it for leisure or whether we're doing it for travel, is really important for getting people moving and keeping people moving. One final slide before you can ask me some questions or make some observations, whatever you wish to do. This is the previous. There's always a time lag in this data. So this is 22. This modelling. This is some modelling published by Sport England, which is very helpful. And there's always a year time lag. So this is done on last year's data. You just need to, and I'm pointing that out here because there's a bit of a difference in activity levels last year compared to this year, and this might change a little bit when we get the latest version of it. Okay, but there is always a bit of a time lag on it. What you're looking at is the modelled estimation of inactivity down to something called lower super output area, a small area. About 3,000 people, a range of between 1,000 and 3,000 people live in each of those little patchwork coloured areas. Okay, this is how the census, the Office of National Statistics, organises and builds up the census. It goes down to output level, which is really tiny, and about 1,000 people. Then it goes low super output, middle super output, and it's getting bigger. And they fit within each other. Okay, and what Sport England have done is they've modelled using the national data set and then looking at the demographics. What does the population look like in each of these communities, in each of these neighbourhoods that have been identified, and they put the two together. What's inactivity like nationally for these different demographic groups? What's it look like in Herefordshire as a local authority? And then in each of these places, what does the population look like so that we can estimate a level of inactivity? Okay. And so you get this patchwork quilt. The dark blue areas are 22 to 24% of inactivity. Okay. Now remember that inactivity was a bit higher last year. It was around 24, 25%. Okay. So it's dropped quite a bit in that recent year. And you can start to see that they're the places where inactivity is in the main better on average. But then you get into the yellow and orange and red. Okay. The range gets bigger because we've split an equal number of these lower super output areas into each colour. Okay, that's how the map's been done. Okay, but if you start to look at the orange and the red now, you're starting to look at the areas where inactivity is likely to be inactive because of the population that lives there. Okay, so we're going to have more people on lower incomes. We're going to have more people with a limited illness and disability. Some of these areas will be quite different to each other. Some of the urban areas might be people on lower incomes, maybe diverse communities, but actually younger. Some of those rural areas might be more related to age and disability. Okay, so that's, unpicking that is something that we can do if it's important to do so. But we can start to look at where this makes us think. And what I would observe from this is it's getting quite useful data compared to the way that they've done it historically, because it's starting to bring out rurality. They might not be the reddest areas in this, but it is starting to show you some of the rural areas where inactivity is higher. And we've not always had that. There's always been a bit of a lazy assumption that our rural areas are all right. And this is telling us that's not quite the case.